I'd like to introduce our chair, Dr. Gill. Joel is an international development geoscientist at the British Geological Survey, and he's the founder and executive director of the charity Geology for Global Development. He focuses on sustainable development and disaster risk reduction, working at scales from individual communities in Tanzania to advocacy at the United Nations, and he's just got back from a UN Forum on Science and Technology. And Joel is a co-investigator at the BGS project and the BGS project leader for the Global Challenges Research Fund's Urban Disaster Risk Hub, aiming to reduce disaster risk for the poorest citizens in tomorrow's cities. So I shall hand you over to his capable hands for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you. It's a great honour to be here. And let me just first offer my congratulations to all the team that has coordinated this fantastic event. I think it's great to be having this discussion, and we've got a fantastic panel of people here who I will introduce to you shortly. In 2015, the United Nations agreed a comprehensive plan for the eradication of poverty, a transition to inclusive social development where all individuals can thrive, and environmental sustainability, reducing consumption and tackling climate change. Stakeholders around the world, national governments, the private sector, academia, civil society are working together to deliver this agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that it includes. However, progress made to tackle poverty and inequalities, to ensure sustainable communities for all, access to quality services such as healthcare, education, clean water and sanitation, this progress is threatened by environmental shocks, natural hazards, and the way in which they interact with exposure, vulnerability to generate disasters. The UN have estimated that between 1998 and 2017, disasters around the world resulted in economic losses of around $3 trillion, 1.3 million fatalities, and 4.4 billion people injured, rendered homeless, displaced, or needing emergency assistance. So if we're to meet our ambitions of a more inclusive, equal and sustainable society at all scales, in all national contexts, then we need to better understand the dynamics of natural hazards, whether that's earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, tsunamis, hurricanes, or many, many others, but also how these hazards interact with society, with community dynamics, with infrastructure to generate risk, and the steps that we can take, again, at different scales to reduce vulnerability of both people and infrastructure to the effects of hazards. Last week, in another United Nations meeting, they published their global assessment report looking at disasters, disaster risk reduction, and it had this paragraph in it. The global policy agenda incorporates a common message: understanding hazard characteristics and how they interact, as well as managing exposure and vulnerability. The core aspects of risk are imperative for development to be achievable, let alone sustainable. Unacknowledged, unaddressed, and unknown risk sits at the heart of the global threat to sustainable development. So I just wanted to highlight that by way of introduction, that this isn't a niche topic just for those interested in hazards and disasters, but this is something that relates to all of our efforts to move towards sustainable development around the world. And so it's great to be having this as the focus of our dialogue today, and as I say, to have a fantastic panel to explore themes around this. Professor Maureen Fordham is Professor of Gender and Disaster Resilience, affiliated with the University College London's Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. She has a particular interest in marginalised and so-called vulnerable groups in disaster, including women and children in particular. Professor Fordham was a founding member of the Gender and Disaster Network in 1997 and is the coordinator of its website and activities. Dr. Robert Muir-Wood is the Chief Research Officer at RMS, Risk Management Solutions, the world's leading catastrophe risk modelling company. In this role, he works on improving catastrophe models for a range of natural hazards, including earthquakes, tropical cyclones, and floods at locations around the world. Solmaz Mahaja is based at the University of Tübingen in Germany, and is the founder and director of Parsquake, a charity enhancing public understanding of earthquakes in the Persian-speaking world. And Dr. Rebecca Williams is a volcanologist and senior lecturer at the University of Hull, who takes an interdisciplinary approach to volcano research, with research focusing on volcano stratigraphy and hazardous volcanic flows such as pyroclastic, dead sea currents and lahars, and then research towards understanding how communities may be affected by volcanic eruptions, past, present and future. So perhaps you could just start by welcoming our four panellists. panel brings together different sectors, disciplines and regional interests, so I'm confident that we'll have a really rich, interesting and useful discussion. I'm going to give each panel member a few minutes to introduce themselves in a bit more detail and given their perspectives on where we're at in 2019, where is risk concentrated and why, either geographically or in terms of certain major and marginalised groups. And then we'll explore some questions together and then take some questions from the floor. Maureen, would you be happy to start?
If I must. Thank you, Jill, and thank you for the invitation. And it's wonderful to be here. It's lovely to have a large audience. So, where did I start? I didn't start with gender, for sure. Not very many people did in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But gradually, working around floods and hazards generally, at Flood Hazard Research Centre at Middlesex University, I suddenly realised there's something missing in our analyses. We're not really getting to the context, the social context, which I'm sure, knowing that social context makes a difference in so many ways, it must be having a difference when we study hazards. But there was practically nothing on it. And so a group of us at the University of Colorado, at the Natural Hazards Workshop in Boulder, Colorado, got together very early one morning in 1997 and said, well, we need to be connected. There's not many of us. We're scattered across the world. Let's start a network. And so that's when we started the Gender and Disaster Network, which has been going ever since with about 1,000 members or so coming and going. I just can't believe that I'm still working on this now. You know, it should have gone. It shouldn't be such a problem. It shouldn't be invisible, and yet it often is. And I think one of the major challenges is still the bringing together, the interdisciplinary breadth of what we should be focusing on. Not to exclude going deep into a particular area or doing basic and blue sky research, but the necessity also alongside that to have this social context. And I could talk a lot more about that, but maybe if you want to pass along the panel, and then I'll probably come back to it.
Brilliant, thank you so much.
Great. So I'd like to start also with where I started thinking about some of the issues related to natural hazards and also communities that are at risk of natural hazards. So in 2006, I was sent to northern Pakistan after a major earthquake event that devastated the entire community there. And I knew personally that this region was prone to earthquakes. My colleagues from the United States also were aware of that. Even the local scientists that were accompanying us in the field and working with us very closely weren't surprised by the earthquake that happened there. But the devastation was quite significant. Many villages were destroyed. As I said earlier today at a different event, more than 80,000 people were killed. 13,000 of them were children. So it was very clear that there was some communication issue there. I started talking with the locals, and very soon I found out that their knowledge of earthquakes was almost close to zero. They didn't know why earthquakes happened. They didn't know that their region was prone to earthquake. They weren't expecting one. They were very much surprised. And that really, the emotion for me at that time was, I was full of anger, because I couldn't understand why in a global community or even like at a local scale, when scientists are aware of such a big issue, why the people who are affected by these issues are not aware of them. And so it became very clear that it's not really the lack of information, but it's lack of access to information. And by lack of access, I don't mean that these communities, they don't have the knowledge there, but maybe this knowledge is communicated in a way that it is not effective. There are language barriers, there are cultural barriers, and these are the issues that I decided to highlight and really tackle through the initiative that I'm leading, which is called the Parsway Project. Mostly by bringing science-based information to the public who really need it the most, in the most effective and meaningful way.
Brilliant. Thank you. Rebecca.
Hi, so I'm a volcanologist, so I very much specifically focus on that field of research. 600 million people live in an area potentially impacted by volcanic eruptions. And whilst our understanding of volcanism is improving all the time, and in general, if you look at kind of the trends, the casualties, the deaths resulting from volcanic eruptions is decreasing. In the last 30 years, 2 million people were displaced by volcanic eruptions. So these often rare-ish events compared to some natural hazards, such as flooding. These are rare events, but they can have these dramatic consequences. So I come from a background of being a physical volcanologist, so I want to understand how a volcano is going to erupt, how it's going to behave, and in particular, I study catastrophic flows on volcanoes, such as pyroclastic density currents. So these are the big swooping clouds of ash and gas and rocks that come from volcanoes. You've probably heard about Pompeii, so these are the flows that devastated Pompeii, or mud flows and lahars. These are some of the most hazardous things that a volcano can do. So that's my background. Through this, I've worked with things like civil defence, particularly in places like Ecuador, local authorities there to try and understand the particular hazards that different communities face. More recently, I've become involved much more within science communication, so events kind of like this, public lecture events, but also with a growing kind of profile, particularly on social media, become involved much more in communicating directly to people who are directly impacted by these kind of volcanic eruptions. The rise of things like social media, so 4 billion people now use social media, and this gives them great access to scientists and to the authorities during times of a volcanic crisis. And this is fantastic. It gives them great information about, particularly if a volcanic crisis is happening, but it also creates some potential for difficulties within that communication. And this is a real growing field kind of research. This is becoming something I'm much more involved with more recently, is understanding that the communities that are most vulnerable, how are they receiving information? How is that information getting to them? Are they getting the access to the scientists that we on social media think that we're communicating to them, the authorities think that they're communicating to them, and how is that understood locally, and how is that impacting their decisions in a growing volcanic crisis?
Okay, thank you. So I think as we're hearing, communicating around risk and measuring risk are really key components of actually taking action around disasters. And probabilistic catastrophe loss modelling, that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll say it again. Probabilistic catastrophe loss modelling was initially developed about 30 years ago. It was developed originally to support the catastrophe insurance market because it became completely clear that simply using a few decades of data didn't tell you everything that could happen. You had instead, in a model, you create a synthetic history of perhaps 100,000 simulation years of potential disasters, and you break the problem down into the discrete components of what we call the stochastic model, which tries to capture all the potential events, the hazard footprint of the events themselves, the exposure and the vulnerability linked together in order to work out how the impact of the event is going to have consequences on causing damage or causing loss. And this area of catastrophe risk modelling has become quite, I'd say, quite rich and developed now. There's an industry of catastrophe modelling which is worth about $500 million a year, in fact, now of activity for a wide range of perils. This information we want, I guess, what I'm particularly interested in, I mean, at present we can output from these models economic loss and also fatalities, expected fatalities in disasters. I champion trying to use these models for actually taking action to measure progress in disaster risk reduction. So I was out at the Geneva platform meeting last week as well, and actually talking, my soapbox on which I like to stand is to try and get the measurement of progress in disaster risk reduction achieved using models. You can't simply wait for disasters to happen to tell you whether a particular country is or is not making progress. We had the situation in Haiti where from 1900 to 2000, fewer than 10 people were killed in earthquakes in Haiti, and then in one afternoon in 2010, in January 2010, more than 200,000 were killed. You can't simply take a 10-year period and tell you whether you are doing well or doing badly around disasters. We should be risk auditing countries and cities using catastrophe risk models to measure if they are making progress, and we need to publicize that. We need to do it using standardized methodologies. Only then will we know whether initiatives like the Sendai initiative for disaster risk reduction, only then we will know if it's making real progress. We can't simply use a 10-year period and see what happens in a 10-year period and know whether we're making progress or not. So I would like to champion all this technology, all this capability that has been developed in support originally of insurance, of risk transfer, of catastrophe bonds, is now moving over to be used for humanitarian and disaster risk reduction ends.
So around communication, around the use of technology, around access to information. But let's just go back to the start as to what makes a community particularly susceptible to the impacts of a hazard. Maureen, do you want to expand a little bit on why a community in, for example, Guatemala may be much more impacted by an earthquake than a community in California, for example? What's the characteristics that maybe drive that vulnerability?
I think first of all I would underline the word community because that's such a contested term now. We tend to use it in this homogenizing way, usually with a geographical boundary around it, which is quite useful when we're talking hazards. But within that geographical boundary, and it may be a floodplain envelope or whatever it might be, there's huge diversity within it. So you can make some broad statements, I think, comparing Latin America with North America or Europe, etc. But then you still need to dig inside it. So I think we still lack disaggregated data. You know, this is my soapbox. It's so important to have disaggregated data, and the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals that Joel was speaking of, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, have, since 2015, put the need for disaggregated data into their frameworks. Still, unfortunately, voluntary, not mandated in the Sendai Framework, which is a big challenge. And Sendai Framework was 2015, it's now 2019. How much progress do we have in collecting and analysing, applying and making change out of disaggregated data? Very little. So we lack disaggregated data. We have I don't want to use the word anecdotal because it sounds a bit demeaning, but you know, we have a case study here, a case study there. We have lots of different case studies, but we don't have systematic collection of disaggregated data, disaggregated by, well, I would say disaggregated by gender and age at a minimum. But if you look at the SDGs, seeking a commitment to increase significantly the availability of high quality, timely and reliable data disaggregated by income, gender, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, geographic location, and other characteristics relevant in national contexts, and I would say local contexts as well. Can you imagine what that data set would look like in order to carry out some robust analysis across those groups? It would be enormous. So we have the need, because we don't have the knowledge yet about how disasters are affecting different groups. I'll actually get to your question in a minute. We have some of that knowledge, but we don't have this systematic approach to it. If you look at the 2007, drawing from memory, Eric Neumeier and Plumper's article, which modelled the gender dynamics, really, of disasters, then their statistical analysis across the data sets that were available showed consistently women dying generally more often than men and dying at an earlier age. However, if you then looked at that by socioeconomic status, then that differential in fatalities fell away to almost zero, so you've got almost equality. So you're much more likely to, as a woman, to die in an earthquake or any other hazard if socioeconomic conditions are unequal and polarized. So if you were to compare Latin America with North America and with Europe, say, then that's where you'll see that kind of gradient. But you still need to look within it, because you will find, if you look within a rich country, you've only got to look at Hurricane Katrina to see, within a rich country, you've got a gradient, a social economic gradient, where certain groups are going to be more likely to die than others. And that's just the social, broad brush social aspect. We could then go into building regulations, cultural attitudes to appropriate buildings and desirable buildings, and a whole range of other matters that would fall out from that. So it's a complex field, actually, even though you could make some broad brush statements. If you dig down deep, there's a lot of detail that we still need to explore.
So vulnerability is perhaps a term that we use quite loosely, but is actually incredibly complex. Lots of interweaving factors that affect different scales and different places, whether it's at an individual level or an institutional level or a broader societal level. And the key is data. We need to collect more data, disaggregated data, to really get a more enriched picture of what vulnerability looks like.
I think that would be the first step. You'd still then need a whole raft of other things, including political will to act upon that. And I think there's a hidden danger, which is a bit of a secret, really, which is if we encourage member states to collect disaggregated data, and I think I was also at the global platform in Geneva last week. The ministers will have to stand up every couple of years and talk about what their state has been doing in terms of reducing disaster risk. And if you were a minister, you probably wouldn't want to say, actually, we killed a lot of old people, or a lot of our women died. So there is a hidden political hot potato hidden within the collection of disaster disaggregated data.
Okay. So data is the starting point. Obviously, we have to go beyond that. But let's go to the hazard side of this now, the hazard data that we need. So someone as Rebecca, perhaps both of you could reflect a little bit. We have quite a diverse audience. I think not everybody's comes from an earth science background on the types of data that we would collect to understand natural hazards, but also what the current state of play is in terms of data for natural hazards. Do we understand things well? What are the kind of big missing aspects of data that perhaps we need to invest or research in order to help and strengthen disaster risk reduction?
Okay, so thinking about kind of volcanoes. So if we want to understand if a volcano is going to erupt and how is it going to erupt, we actually, you talked about kind of where are we state of play, we kind of go back to basics. So we'd go out and do some geological mapping. So for the non-geologists in the audience, this is where you get a map, you go to a place and you record what rocks are there. You go to another place and you record what rocks are there, and you eventually build up a geological map of the area. And then you start looking at the stratigraphy. So the sequence of rocks, they were all in place by different ways. And you look at the age of them and you try to interpret how those rocks were in place. So you go for a particular volcano, you'd look for deposits from pyroclastic density currents, from lahars, from lavas, you'd look for ash horizons, and try and build up a picture of what that volcano has done through time. You'd try and get good dates on the rocks to try and understand when those events took place, when those eruptions took place, and so how kind of regularly you might expect this particular volcano to do its thing. There is huge gaps in geological data. So for you to go and look at a particular deposit, that has to be preserved, so it has to have been formed and it has to have been not eroded away. And you have to be able to find it, and many volcanoes that we have are jungle or covered in vegetation or under cities sometimes now. And so you have difficulties in accessing data, you have difficulties in preserving the different rocks. Volcanoes tend to erode as many rocks as they tend to form, so there's big gaps in our stratigraphy. And then as our volcano science moves on, our interpretations change. So it's not the case that we can figure out a volcano stratigraphy and then that's true fact. We often revisit areas where stratigraphies have been kind of done and completely revise them. So where we thought there was only 5 big eruptions, actually there were 7. Where we thought there were 20, actually there's only 2, and we completely misunderstood that volcano stratigraphy. And this is where the difficulty of really understanding these geohazards comes in, because there's huge uncertainty in the data that we have. So I get asked many times, like, Yellowstone, that's overdue for an eruption. For a start, they don't work on human timescales, there's no clock where it's thinking, right, okay, it's time for me to erupt now. But also, our understanding changes so much that while we think we might have a cyclicity to a particular volcano, it has a particular kind of rhythm to its eruptions, new data can change that instantly. And so we have these big, not only kind of gaps in data, but kind of uncertainty around our kind of evolving science. And I guess you have very similar, even worse problems with earthquakes, because they don't tend to be preserved in the rock records as well, right?
Yeah. For understanding earthquakes, we first need to know where faults are, and faults are fractures in the earth that along which movement occurs, and every time you have a slip or a movement, you tend to generate an earthquake. So the very first thing for us to know is where the fault is, but also whether or not this fault is active. There's no reason to worry about a fault that is not active. So once we know where these faults are, either by mapping them also in the field, or sometimes you can see their surface expression if they have it on satellite imagery, then what you need to know is when was the last time that this fault had an earthquake. And if this fault had an earthquake long time ago in geologic time scale, beyond Quaternary, so beyond 2.6 million years ago, the tendency is that we don't really worry about it. But if in its recent history it had an earthquake, we want to know when that earthquake was, and that comes from paleoseismic records. So these are earthquakes that occurred a long time ago, and for that we also have to go in the field and dig trenches to figure out when the last earthquake or series of earthquakes associated with that fault was. One of the problems that we have also is if we are looking only at historical earthquakes to understand the return time of earthquakes, is that just like volcano data, earthquake records are also full of gaps and they're not very long. Only about 170 years ago, we were able to actually record earthquake with seismographs, and even about 70 years ago, I would say that we started to have a good understanding of very large earthquakes and what they look like. So the history is very short, and if the time interval of an earthquake is really long, which is often the case for earthquakes that happen in the India Himalaya collusion zone, the earthquake, for instance, that happened in Nepal, the short historic earthquake that we have is not going to help us a lot with estimating the return interval for that earthquake. So that's an issue that we have.
Just as a quick follow-up question, Rebecca, we don't know the same about all volcanoes doing. So you mentioned access could be one reason why physical access because of jungle or cities, but are there other reasons linked to equity, resource that mean that we know more about some volcanoes than others, and where are the volcanoes that perhaps we know least about?
Absolutely. So there are some incredibly well-studied volcanoes, somewhere like Kilauea in Hawaii. We not only have kind of written records, we have oral histories from the Hawaiian communities there, and the USGS has a volcano observatory there. They're probably the most funded geological survey on the planet. And it's a drive-up volcano. It's a lovely place to work. You can take your car and you can literally drive up to the rocks and really understand the data. Obviously, in different parts of the world, there is a huge problem around monetary resources. So we have volcano observatories that are running on shoestring budgets, largely with volcano volunteers. Places like Colima, they have student volunteers that are really doing the hard work in collecting the data there because they don't have a budget to do kind of big programs like such as USGS have. You have problems with access. Some of these places are really remote. They have communities around them, but then they don't have good transportation infrastructure links. They might perhaps not be accessible to scientists to be able to go in there if you have things like civil unrest. But the biggest problem that we have, particularly in volcanology, are the volcanoes that we don't know are volcanoes. So things like Pinatubo, the great big eruption in 1991, we didn't know it was a volcano until it started erupting. So when it started showing signs of unrest and there was kind of an ash clouds and the reports came from the communities, so Philvox, the Philippine Volcano Observatory, the first thing they had to do was quickly rush out there and by helicopter and try and figure out what on earth this volcano does when it erupts. So they were starting from zero information about that volcano at the point of where it's erupting. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have really is because volcanoes can be dormant for 10,000 years or more, they go unstudied largely if they're not particularly accessible until they start posing a risk to people. And then all of a sudden it's kind of action stations, and if you don't have the resources to suddenly throw at that, then you're in great difficulty.
Move to you now. We've heard a lot about the challenges of data. Your catastrophe models presumably are very dependent on access to data, both hazard data and also data on exposure and vulnerability. I'm wondering how you deal with some of those challenges of limitations on data when developing your catastrophe models, and how you communicate uncertainty around that to various organisations that then use those.
Okay, because I'm going to interpret your question to focus a little bit on the human dimension of comprehending the hazards and actually making sense of them in terms of the impacts that they have. And in particular, I want to look at two components. One is what I call denialism, which is actually beyond ignorance. It's actually deliberately suppressing information which may be available. And if we go back, I mean, if you recall the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, it was completely unforecasted. I mean, there was actually in nobody's model that such an earthquake could happen. The 2011 magnitude 9 earthquake in Japan, there had been some discussion about the potential of such an earthquake, but it had been very much suppressed by the nuclear industry who had built something like 17 nuclear power stations along the coastline, the Pacific coastline of Japan, because it was believed to be a zone which didn't have earthquakes of such size and accompanying tsunamis. We're still in denial. I mean, around the world, there are many places where you could also potentially have magnitude 9 earthquakes, which where it's not discussed, there's no preparation. I mean, you take the island of Barbados, for example, is potentially right in the front line of a magnitude 9 earthquake and massive tsunami. It's not, you know, the island does not want to talk about it because of the tourist industry, because of encouraging people to believe this is a safe location. Barbados is also in the path of Category 5 hurricanes as well, as intense as Irma or Maria hitting Barbuda and other islands in the Caribbean. So we first of all, I mean, this denialism is a key factor in ensuring that preparations will not have been taken. I mean, there will not have been tsunami drills in Barbados. I don't believe they happen. So the impact is not simply the event itself, the hazard. It's the context, it's the human context of it, and actually how it's prepared for or not prepared for is going to affect the outcome. And the second human factor, which is really critical for volcanic eruption, the volcano with the largest concentration of population in its vicinity is Vesuvius and Naples. And actually, the Vesuvius volcano, there is effectively a disaster manager who's given the totally poisoned chalice job of being in charge of determining when people are intended to evacuate. And you can imagine a situation, I mean, it is, I don't know why anybody would volunteer for this job. The last time people were in this situation in Italy, in the L'Aquila earthquake, they were effectively thrown in jail for not forecasting the earthquake or not encouraging people to move out of their houses. You can imagine a situation with Vesuvius where it starts erupting and people are told to leave, and then it fizzles out a bit and they drift back again. And trying to manage that process, I mean, it is ultimately the impact of a forecastable disaster is going to be determined by the human reaction. And in modelling these impacts, we have to model what we anticipate the human reaction to be, because that's going to be a key component of what actually happens.
So take that denialism, for example. What could be done by the hazards community if the government is resistant to do something in that context? Is there a space for the private sector or civil society to get involved in risk reduction, either at an educational level or at an advocacy level?
Well, I mean, clearly it does come down to education and information and a government, I mean, that has to acknowledge the reality of the fact that it's in a hazardous location, but that if it takes sufficient action, it can prevent a lot of the impacts of disasters. I mean, you first of all have to accept, you know, something that California does very well is that it's constantly discussing and rediscussing and re-communicating the fact that big earthquakes are going to happen, and by that means it hopes it can encourage people to prepare. They have simulation exercises in schools. So they do a lot of activity to make it part of the culture, to make people aware of what preparations they have to take. That they have to, their house. They have a lot of material waiting for the time when there were 3-day power outages after a big earthquake. So there's a lot one can do. I mean, the work in Central Asia is clearly starting. And communication is the key starting point, because then there's a lot you can do. You don't need to be totally scared of disasters. You just need to have done the effective preparation.
Thomas, is hazards on the curriculum in schools in Tajikistan? Is it something that you've worked to bring onto the curriculum because it's not a part of the formal education there, or is it there but you're enriching that?
Information about hazards, no, it's not part of the curriculum, and this was something I did not know until I started talking and interviewing systematically school children in urban cities, urban environments in Tajikistan and also in northern Pakistan. They do learn about some concepts related to earthquakes, mostly earth sciences concepts like the interior structure of the earth, plate tectonics at higher grade levels, but hazards are not discussed. And this is a problem because many of the communities that I work with are not only going to experience earthquake in the near future, but there are also secondary hazards associated with earthquakes, such as liquefaction and landslides, especially in the mountain communities. And there's hardly any discussions of those hazards as well. There is an indigenous knowledge in some of these communities that I work with, which means that the older population and some of the younger population are aware of their risk. There is an example of the community in Central Asia in the Pamir Mountains that when I asked them, are you aware of earthquakes here? For instance, if an earthquake happens, what will you do? How would you protect yourself? And oftentimes I heard a story that they would stay indoors and they would go, for instance, to the columns of a building that are supporting the weight of the structure. And I asked them, why do you go to the columns of these buildings? And they said, well, each column represents a prophet in their religion, which is Islam. And for me, that was very interesting because I thought that this could be some kind of a cultural explanation, some kind of a religious explanation of their understanding of hazards. But the more I talked to the community and also to earthquake engineers, the more I understood why the community and the people do that during earthquakes. And this is because these particular buildings have been built to resist earthquakes. And the way that they're built is that if there's an earthquake, the walls of the building will collapse externally, and the columns are the strongest points of the building. And even though in the explanation that the locals gave me, that wasn't very clear to me, it very quickly became clear that there is an indigenous knowledge of the hazards, and it's very important for us to tap into that and use that as a starting point, really, to talk about hazards and how we can mitigate damage associated with them.
I'm going to open up some questions from the floor. I suggest that we take 3 questions at the same time, and then we'll come to the panel to address those. So we'll keep a note of what's been asked, and then we can go back to the floor and get another few questions there. That's probably the most efficient way to do this. So, yeah, does anybody have any questions? This one, do we need the mic to capture for the video, or no?
Thank you. I'd like to ask about disaggregated data and how that is collected right now, and the possibility of wide-scale collection of data using proxy sources such as satellite imagery. Back in my mind is, if you're interested in poverty, of course you can go out on the ground and do surveys and ask people their income and all this kind of stuff. The alternative is to use satellite imagery and look at buildings and then indirectly determine that the building associated with people who are poor, simply by the state for building. Is there much momentum behind building these kind of proxy measures, or is it still very much a survey-based method or approach to disaggregated data?
Brilliant, thanks for that. Anybody else got a question, and then we'll come and address these? Yeah.
Yeah, I have one question. I'm coming more from a weather forecasting background, and in weather forecasting, we have usually a lot of probabilistic information available. So basically, for every event, we know the percentage of which it's going to happen. And so we're starting from the models we use. We have a whole industry of private weather services that kind of fill the gap between having the raw information available and then translating this information to the actual policymakers, for example, industries that actually can use this information and then say, for example, a threshold of 30% chance of this event is happening, then we actually do action or not in order, for example, to decrease false positive or false negative actions. How's that in, let's say, more the geohazards, so volcanic eruptions and also earthquakes? How much of these, let's say, private services are in between, and how much problems are there still in the communication of what is actually scientifically known, but not well translated to the activity?
Brilliant, thank you. Any final, one at the back there?
I want to ask about communicating uncertainty, especially when it comes to limitation of data, like you don't have enough data to do your work, and you need to give advice to say policymakers or people working. And how do you communicate that kind of uncertainty to them? Like, I didn't get enough data to say this, but these are the results that we have, and this is what we expect. So how do you do that communication?
Brilliant, thank you. Should we start with disaggregated data then, Maureen? Or others can obviously jump in if they want to.
There's a lot of interest in disaggregated data, and because it's embedded in the global frameworks, then the UN system has got behind this, and so you will find a number of working groups who are trying to find ways of doing this and doing it appropriately. I suppose it also comes back to the problem I alluded to at the start, which is for social and political reasons, we might want very fine-grained disaggregation. But to get to that is extremely expensive and extremely time-consuming. And so there's got to be some kind of trade-off somewhere. I mean, proxy data could be another way of doing that, depending on who you are. But for sure, people are looking at all possible ways because of the challenge. I suppose Sendai is really gender, age and disability focused, plus the others if you're lucky, but primarily those. And a number of us have been talking about how to do that. What are the indicators? The danger is that you measure what can be measured instead of what should be measured. And that's often a resource argument, really. Time and money will dictate what actually gets connected in the end. Then you've got to add that to systems available to member states, and there's only a minority of member states around the world who are collecting disaster data at all, never mind disaggregated. So there were very, very lengthy and quite heated discussions during the run-up to during the negotiations of the framework, where those of us who advocate in various ways were part of all of the discussions and advocating as we could, but still there was a pulling back. And I know I was speaking to the UN Women chief statistician in New York, and they had been closeted away for weeks trying to work out the best way they could do this, to get as much as they could that was still going to be manageable. And for member states who, most member states around the world don't have the kind of resources that we can call upon, for example. So it becomes this challenge and a millstone round some states' necks to have to do this. So the proxy route could be a very useful way of doing this. But I'm sure other colleagues can come in on this. There's definitely a lot of discussion around this. Whether there's more heat than light, I don't know, in terms of progress. We've still got a long way to go on that.
There are two other questions as well, but feel free if you've got anything to add to that as well. One around the use of private services for communicating, translating information around the geohazard side, so comparing with weather forecasting, and one around communicating uncertainty, the limitations of data to policymakers. I don't know if you would like to jump in there.
Yeah. I mean, in risk modelling, the output of a risk model, of a catastrophe risk model, is what's called an exceedance probability curve, plotting severity versus frequency of outcome or expected outcome, and from which you can pull off your 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 level of impact, and that could be in terms of economic impact, or it could be in terms of lives lost. But it's trying to deliver a probabilistic perspective, and from which you can also come up with the average annualized loss, which is the amount you need to set aside each year to pay for all your future losses. So I mean, there's a basic probabilistic framework of delivering data. I mean, it has some similarities with ensemble modelling in weather forecasting, and the same climate models are being used to generate the event set of potential storms or potential floods as are used for forecasting. So there are parallels. I mean, the question about uncertainty, the delivery of uncertainty, is clearly. I mean, you can spend, and we have spent sort of 6-month projects digging deeper and deeper and deeper into all the components of uncertainty, and trying to display uncertainty, trying to make hundreds of alternative models in which you can show the sensitivity to parameter uncertainty and model uncertainty of your outcome. So I mean, and at the end of it all, it is still subjective. There's a sort of final component. There is still a subjective component of uncertainty there. So you have to communicate to people about uncertainty. And I think weather forecasts are incredibly interesting things, because they teach people, they almost are a perfect way of teaching about uncertainty. Because the weather forecaster gets it wrong every now and again. Most of the time they say 80% chance of rain, and then sometimes, the last few weeks, there's been a 25% chance of rain each hour during the day, and there's been no rain at all. And that sort of teaches you to slightly distrust the delivery of probabilistic information, at the same time as understanding that you have to do that. And I think that's a great education in understanding what uncertainty is, and understanding also that you need to talk about probabilities.
Okay, thank you. Rapidly, you had something to add, but I just want to check, can we run to 25 to just get started a few minutes late? Great.
It's an interesting kind of comparison to the meteorological industry in kind of volcanic hazards. We're not at a stage that we can make those kind of predictions. We can't say there's a 30% chance of volcanic eruption tomorrow in the same way as kind of the meteorological community can. And that's kind of really depending, because of a few things. There's the lack of the data about a particular volcano in terms of its cyclicity and what kind of eruptions it's had, and the recurrence of those. But also, when we do have there are attempts to do by using event trees and probabilistic kind of modelling. But one of the big problems that we have is that these kind of forecasts are relying on monitoring data. So you have a particular volcano, and we kind of listen to its kind of heartbeat in various ways. So you can track the volcanic tremors, which tells you about magma movement. You can measure the volcanic gases that are coming out, and that can tell you whether magma is coming to the surface or not. You can look at it breathing, deformation, as the magma comes up, it inflates and then deflates. And all those things, when you start putting them together and you model those, you can start forecasting that an eruption is likely to happen. And most places have these kind of scales, like likely to happen in the X months, weeks, years, days. But the problem is that volcano monitoring to do all those different things is hugely resource intensive, and you have to have instruments on the ground at those particular volcanoes. But often what happens is we don't have that in place until the volcano starts showing unrest. And if a particular place is lucky, then the instruments get put into place. But the problem is you don't have the historical longitudinal data. So you know what it's doing right now, but we don't know if this has always been the case, but we just haven't been listening. And so that's a really big problem with these kind of more rare kind of geohazards. And because we're not always monitoring all the volcanoes, we don't have that data to put into the probabilistic methods that you would have in meteorology.
I have so many questions, but I feel like we're only just scratching the surface, but there'll be lots of time over a drink to ask more questions. But what I want to do is just give you all the chance to conclude and finish by throwing out a couple of quick questions for quick answers. One is around what challenges does the 21st century pose in terms of disaster risk? What are the things that we need to be wary of in terms of the way in which societies are developing and shaping? But I'm a optimist by nature, so also what's a really good example of risk reduction that you've seen through your work that's having or had a tangible impact on the ground? Is there something that you can inspire us with by way of your final words to demonstrate that disasters aren't inevitable and that there are concrete things that we can do to reduce their impacts? Solmaz, do you want to start?
In terms of challenges, I'd like to mention buildings. I mean, the population today, we all live in houses, in structures, and depending on where you are in the world, you could be living in structures that are quite safe for you or not. I think one of the biggest challenges are megacities, especially cities that are located in areas that are prone to earthquakes. So I'm thinking of places like San Francisco, Istanbul, Tehran, Bishkek, Dushanbe. These are all urban centers that have been urbanized very quickly, and because of this quick urbanization and the housing had to happen very quickly and almost always without any compliance to engineering codes for earthquakes. So this is one of the biggest problems that we have. We first need to know where these buildings are, as you mentioned, like how can we actually use the technology we have today on ground or from satellite imagery to map these vulnerable buildings. And once we know where these buildings are, then we can start talking about, okay, how can we mitigate damage to these structures? So I would say, in terms of earthquake hazards, let's start with vulnerable buildings.
In terms of a challenge, I think a big challenge for us now is dealing with complexity and complex systems. And just using the disaggregated data as an example, we've suddenly made the analyses and everything else around it much more complex. But also the resilience term, everybody talks about resilience, and everybody accepts that that's quite a complex area, and we need to know about it, we need to engender it, but how do we do that? How do we deal with complexity? So I think that's still a big challenge, practically on the ground. And in terms of a good example, I would put forward thinking more broadly about how we define science and scientists. And I could give an example of the Garifuna Emergency Committee of grassroots women in Honduras who've developed so many techniques for bringing together disaster and development issues, in reducing risk, in having food stores, seed stores, tool stores, rescuing people, moving people out of risky areas. And these are subsistence farmers in Honduras, grassroots, women-led committees, who are also scientists and also at UN last week and quite prepared to stand up and address the UN.
Brilliant, thank you. Robert?
Okay, I will give you two very quickly. One is an organisation called Build Change, which is a woman-led engineering NGO which focuses on training the builders and training the trainers of builders in countries like Nepal and Haiti and Sumatra, and so has really been very successful at raising money and getting out to the community and trying to change the culture of buildings. And one place completely separately where I've seen real progress in managing disaster risk is in the country of Chile, which used to be, if you went back to around 1900, it was one of the most dangerous places in the world in terms of earthquake frequency and how badly built the buildings were. And they've totally transformed the buildings. They have a really tough building code against earthquake impacts, and they enforce it really ruthlessly. And if you're a builder and your building falls down within 10 years of you finishing that building, you go to jail. And this has proved earthquakes are so frequent that no politician can duck the issue and simply assume in their period of tenure they don't need to worry about it. So it's really a country which is, as a whole culture, has recognised it's on the front line for earthquakes, is taking action to reduce the risk.
That's amazing, thanks. Rebecca, final words.
Okay, I kind of want to pick up on some points that have been made about kind of education and knowledge. So we're here communicating to you, the people, and often we talk about kind of around geohazards and risk about scientists communicating to people and educating people. And I think in many ways we need to think about kind of decolonising the way we think about kind of geohazard science and actually respecting indigenous knowledge, and actually think rather communication being a two-way interaction, and actually think about co-production of knowledge around this, both in terms of what communities know about the hazards they face, how they prepare for it, and then also building in kind of disaster risk resilience. So a particular example that I want to speak to is Tungurahua in Ecuador. So in '99, the volcano started to go through a period of unrest, started to erupt. There was forced evacuations. This created huge tensions between the authorities, the Instituto Geofísico, who was monitoring the volcano, the military were brought in, and the communities. And so the trust in the scientists completely broke down. And then in 2000, they started something called the Vigias. These are the watchers of the volcano. And I was there in 2005. I was lucky enough to stay at the Volcano Observatory there. And 8 o'clock in the evening, there is a series of radio conversations with these Vigias around the volcano. And these are local people who are tasked with observing the volcano and then reporting back what they see to the Volcano Observatory and to the Instituto. So they are actually doing the monitoring kind of work, and the Institute is respecting their knowledge, they're gaining information from them, but in return, the local community, they see that somebody from within them is involved in this monitoring process. So through this, there's been a huge increase in trust and better communication. In 2006, there's another period of unrest, and in the areas where the Vigias were really active, evacuations went very successfully. There were pyroclastic density currents going down the Privé Grande, and there was no kind of casualties and no deaths. Unfortunately, in an area where they weren't so well established and there were casualties, it just really goes to show that where there is this two-way communication, co-production of knowledge, and you're getting the communities to talk to the authorities as trusted people, you can really then change the way that people behave and act when a crisis hits.
So thank you. Well, I think that brings us to our time that we have. I think we've heard from 4 different perspectives, but some really strong key themes coming through in terms of the importance of interdisciplinarity, the importance of two-way conversation, recognising that communication starts with listening, understanding local perspectives, local priorities, local ideas, enriching our data by listening to communities. I think we've heard some really inspiring examples of disaster risk reduction on the ground that's practically happening. There are challenges in terms of cities building, but there is also, I think, a push and momentum, particularly in the UK, towards interdisciplinary research, which is exciting. And I think when you look at what the UN is putting across, certainly the push moving from disaster management and responding to disasters to reducing risk overall, which is a positive trend. So let me thank again our panel for being willing to share their perspectives, their ideas. Thank you for your engagement. Thanks again to the organisers for doing such a fantastic job at bringing this group together to have this. I'm sure there are many more questions, so please do join us for a drink afterwards to ask them to the panel. Yeah, thank you.